Okay, in this lecture, we will talk about the Pastoral Epistles. We talk about the authorship. All three of them are kind of considered together, so I'll discuss the issues about authorship for all three letters all at once. The question of authorship for all three pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, has been contested in the modern era. Arguments focus on external and internal evidence, so we'll consider the question of authorship for all three letters together. Let's talk about the external evidence. The author is identified in the opening of the letter as Paul the Apostle. There are similarities between the pastoral epistles and Clement's epistle to the Corinthians. Some would see this as proof that they were written before Clement wrote, and he was influenced by them. But others flip the assumption around and say that the pastorals were written after Clement and that they have been influenced by Clement. Others do not see clear influence either way. And I'm going to share a quote from Guthrie in his New Testament introduction. There are indications that the epistles were known and used by Polycarp, Justin, Heraclian, and others, while by the time of Irenaeus, they were definitely regarded as Pauline. So that's the quote from Guthrie. Polycarp lived around AD 69 to 156. Justin lived from around AD 100 to 165. Heraclian was prominent around AD 175. Irenaeus lived around AD 140 to 202. The Muratorian fragment, the most ancient list of New Testament books found to date, is dated to around AD 180 and lists 22 of the 27 books we have in our New Testament. In that canon, the pastoral epistles are included in the group of Paul's letters. People who reject Paul as authors, so that's external evidence, very ancient external evidence that, around 180, these were considered to have been written by Paul. People who reject Paul as author point out that the pastorals are not included in Marcion's canon, supposedly because they had not been written yet in his day. He lived AD 85 to 160. But Marcion was a heretic known for rejecting any books that did not conform to his preconceived ideas. He rejected Matthew, Mark, and John, and mutilated Luke. The pastoral epistles are missing in the Chester Beatty papyri, P46 from around AD 250, but the codex is not complete. It is missing its final pages, and it's not inconceivable that the pastorals would naturally have been in this concluding section. So that's external evidence. Let's talk about internal evidence. Objections to Pauline authorship focus on the historical setting. It appears from Titus that Paul has left him on the island of Crete, but this does not seem to accord with Paul's travels recorded in the book of Acts. In Acts, the only visit of Paul to Crete takes place on his final voyage to Rome. Paul is imprisoned in that instance, but in his letter to Titus, Paul is in Nicopolis on the western coast of Greece and gives no indication of being imprisoned. While some scholars seek ways to weave the pastorals within the Acts narrative, the most common approach is to postulate a series of events after the end of Acts. Paul is initially released from prison and enjoys a period of freedom during which he writes 1 Timothy and Titus. Then he is imprisoned once again in Rome and writes 2 Timothy from prison shortly before his death. Another objection to Pauline authorship is the supposed late ecclesiology evident in his instructions. It is suggested that during Paul's lifetime, the churches were very loosely organized. In the early 2nd century, church structure became more rigid and uniform, with the offices of elder and deacon more clearly defined. Since Paul describes the qualities elders and deacons should possess, some assume that the work was an early 2nd century pseudepigrapha. Against this is the clear early attestation to the presence of both elders and deacons in the life of the church. Why would Paul not speak of this? In rejecting Pauline authorship, some scholars point to the doctrinal differences between the pastoral epistles and other letters of Paul. Absent are the great doctrines, and this is a quote from Guthrie, the great doctrines of the fatherhood of God, the mystic union of the believer with Christ, and the work of the Holy Spirit. And that's the end of the quote. The fact that Paul speaks of the faith, the deposit, and sound teaching is thought to point to a later period in which the Christian faith has become more fixed. But Paul is often defending in his letters the gospel as it has been transmitted. It is nothing new for him to argue that there is a core of belief that must be maintained. Further, the brevity of the pastorals and their nature as encouragement pieces for individuals rather than for congregations at large should account for Paul's choice to focus attention on specific areas and not include every major theological point he could make. Others have made linguistic analyses of the pastorals and point out the presence of and this is a quote from Guthrie, large number of words unique in the New Testament and a large number of words shared by non-Pauline books of the New Testament but not found elsewhere in Paul. In response to this objection, most experts admit that the amount of text available in the pastorals is not large enough for an adequate statistical analysis. The letters are too short for that. Add to this the evident use of amanuenses in Paul's other letters, and linguistic differences are not such an oddity. We have to remember that Paul made use of amanuenses very explicitly in most of his letters. So clearly, the vocabulary choices of the amanuensis are also going to be a part of Paul's letters. Okay, so that kind of covers the authorship, and we do believe that the most likely author of these letters is the Apostle Paul. There's really not significant reason to doubt that they are what they claim to be, personal letters written from the Apostle Paul to Timothy and Titus. So let's get into the actual three letters. We'll start with 1 Timothy and talk about provenance. Not enough is known to identify the place of origin with certainty. The best suggestion is that the letter was written from Macedonia. Paul does not explicitly say that he was in that province when he wrote, but here's what he says in 1 Timothy 1:3. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus. This appears to mean that he had been with Timothy in Ephesus, from which point he went on to Macedonia, leaving his young assistant behind. So now in Macedonia, Paul writes reiterating the instruction he had given Timothy at the point of departure, which would seem to imply that Paul is in Macedonia as he writes. Who's the recipient? Well, we know Timothy is the recipient. Timothy was a child of two worlds. His mother, Eunice, was Jewish and raised him in the Jewish faith, as her own mother, Lois had done. This is mentioned in 2 Timothy 1:5. His father, however, was a Greek. Acts 16:1 makes that clear, and Timothy was not circumcised. He grew up in Lystra. He came to the faith and was well respected both in Lystra and Iconium, according to Acts 16:2. We're not told when he became a Christian, but he did join Paul as he visited Lystra at the beginning of his second missionary tour, and he accompanied him to Macedonia and Greece. Paul circumcised him so that he could accompany him in his work. His standard practice when he entered a new city was to begin sharing in the local synagogue, and Paul knew Timothy would not be admitted into the synagogues if he was not circumcised. So, although Paul vehemently opposed circumcision as a requirement for Christian living and would refuse to make Titus be circumcised, for the open doors it would provide in his current missionary work, he circumcised Timothy. Luke explains why Paul felt the need to do this, and this is from Acts 16:3. He took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. We read later on that there were confirmations of God's call on Timothy's life to ministry. Paul speaks of prophecies previously made about you in 1 Timothy 1:18. In 1 Timothy 4:14, he tells him, "Do not neglect the gift you have, which was given you by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands on you." It is unclear when this took place, but it may have been during Paul's work in Ephesus on his third missionary tour. Ephesus did have 12 elders. In 2 Timothy 1:6, Paul describes a gift of God that Timothy received through the laying on of my hands. On Paul's second missionary tour, when Paul was chased out of Berea, Timothy was left behind with Silas in Macedonia. He stayed in Thessalonica and later brought word to Paul in Corinth of their continued faithfulness. On Paul's third missionary tour, while he was in Ephesus, Timothy was sent again to Macedonia and on down to Corinth to deliver Paul's letter, 1 Corinthians, and to remind them of Paul's ways in Christ. Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 4:17. He must have been young and unimposing, for Paul asks the Corinthian church to put him at ease and warns, "Let no one despise him. Help him on his way in peace, that he may return to me, for I am expecting him with the brothers." That's 1 Corinthians 16:11. It seems that Timothy's original visit to Corinth was not successful, or not as successful as Paul had hoped. Please look at the discussion under 2 Corinthians under situation. We have a much more detailed discussion of all that. Paul eventually sends another, now lost letter, a tearful letter, a harsh letter, and that time he sends it with Titus. Paul leaves Ephesus and travels through Macedonia. Timothy accompanies him, and they are rejoined by Titus in Macedonia, which prompts Paul to write 2 Corinthians and send it ahead of himself to prepare them for his arrival and the gathering of the collection for the saints in Jerusalem. Once Paul arrives in Corinth, he finishes the collection, writes the letter to the Roman churches, and heads back to deliver the offering to Jerusalem. Timothy accompanies him in this journey. Paul is arrested in Jerusalem, spends 2 years in prison at Caesarea before appealing his case to Caesar and being sent to Rome, where he spends at least 2 more years under house arrest in Rome. Timothy next shows up in Paul's letter to the Philippians from prison in Rome. Paul hopes to send him to them soon to see how they are doing. Paul was apparently freed by Nero and was able to do some more work in the East before his final arrest and death under Nero in AD 67-68. What was the date of the writing of 1 Timothy? If Paul was released from his imprisonment in Rome and wrote this letter during his subsequent missionary activities, we should date it during the 60s, probably the mid-60s. It has traditionally been held that the apostle was martyred under Nero, who died in 68. The chronology of his life is not certain, but it is usually thought that he arrived in Rome, as narrated in Acts, in 59 or 60. Allowing for the couple of years of his imprisonment there, according to Acts 28:30, he would have been released sometime maybe in 62. His letter to the Romans shows that he wanted to go to Spain, and he may have done this immediately on release and gone to Macedonia later, or he may have gone immediately to the east and left a trip to Spain until a later time. Eusebius says Paul died in AD 67. If this is correct, we should put the writing of the letter at AD 65 or even 66. Those who take the letter to be pseudonymous generally located at the end of the 1st century or even sometime during the 2nd century. Kumo thinks of a time just after the turn of the 2nd century, for a late date is opposed by the strong Pauline teaching and what he sees as the rudimentary character of the Gnosticism which is resisted. Markson, however, makes it somewhat later. He dates all 3 pastorals at the time well into the 2nd century. If we remove this letter from the lifetime of Paul, there is clearly nothing definite on which to fix our date. Everything then depends on our subjective estimate of the situation presupposed in the letter, and various 2nd century dates are suggested. On the whole, it seems that there is most to be said for the first suggestion, that the letter was written somewhere around AD 65. What was the situation? As it stands, the letter is a private communication to Timothy written by his mentor to give him the guidance he needed for his work as a superintendent of churches. Those who see the letter as pseudonymous think of it rather as a general instruction to anyone in a place of authority, and perhaps also as a letter to give guidance about the Christian way that would be suitable for the general Christian public. Grace be with you in 621 is plural. That's a plural you. And some have therefore argued that the letter was meant for others than Timothy. It is countered that Timothy would be expected to pass on to his congregations the counsel that this letter contains, and that Paul is simply sending his little prayer for them all. It is not easy to think that the letter as a whole is meant for a wide public. In such a case, what are we to make of words such as Timothy, my son, in 1:18, or I hope to come to you soon in 3 verse 14, or don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, chapter 4 verse 12, or something as intimate or occasional as stop drinking only water, chapter 5 verse 23. This letter is surely a personal letter to an individual, whatever public use he might have been expected to make of the teaching given throughout it. And then, what is the purpose of 1 Timothy? Paul writes to a dearly beloved partner in ministry who he views as his son in the faith. Of all the people Paul had worked closely with through the years, Timothy was one of his dearest and closest companions. This letter is meant to help Timothy fight the good fight, chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. He reminds him of the importance of the gospel task and provides guidance in helping the congregations he leads, instruction for women, qualifications for leaders, both pastoral and as servants, deacons. He warns against false teachers and encourages Timothy to be diligent in the gifting God has given him. This letter is meant to strengthen and encourage a young leader in the churches of Asia Minor, providing practical advice for the task of Christian leadership. So let's talk about Titus. Beginning with provenance, Paul indicates in chapter 3:12 that he is in Nicopolis, a city on the western shore of Greece. We have no further information about Paul's presence there, as there is no mention in Acts of him ever visiting the city. It appears that Paul is not in prison as he writes this letter. What do we know about the recipient? The letter is addressed to Titus, a companion of Paul in his travels. Let me quote something from the New Bible Dictionary article about Titus. Although not mentioned, and I'm just going to read this paragraph. Although not mentioned in Acts, Titus was one of Paul's companions in whom he placed a considerable amount of trust. He is first heard of at the time of the Gentile controversy when he accompanied Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem, Galatians 2:1. He provided a test case since he was a Gentile, but he was apparently not compelled to be circumcised, Galatians 2:3. Titus probably accompanied Paul on his subsequent journeys, but no definite information of his work is available until the time of the Corinthian crisis. He had evidently been acting as Paul's representative at Corinth during the year preceding the writing of 2 Corinthians, compare 8:16, with a special commission to organize the collection scheme there. The task was unfinished, for Titus is later urged by Paul to return to Corinth to see its completion, 2 Corinthians 8:6. A more delicate task was the smoothing over the tense situation which had arisen between Paul and the Corinthians, a task which clearly demanded a man of great tact and force of character. He appears to have been a stronger personality than Timothy, as you compare 1 Corinthians 16:10, 2 Corinthians 7:15, and he possessed ability as an administrator. A comparison of 2 Corinthians 2 and 7 suggests that he carried a letter from Paul to the Corinthians, which has since been lost, the severe letter, and in which the apostle took them to task with much anguish of heart for their high-handed attitude. Titus eventually rejoined Paul in Macedonia, according to 2 Corinthians 7:6, with good news, and as a result, 2 Corinthians was written and was willingly carried by Titus, as we see in 2 Corinthians 8:16 and following, who seems to have possessed a particular affection and serious concern for the Corinthians. He is described by the apostle as his partner and fellow worker in chapter 8, verse 23 of 2 Corinthians, who would not think of taking advantage of those entrusted to his care, 2 Corinthians 12:18. From the epistle addressed to him, we can surmise that Titus accompanied Paul to Crete subsequent to the latter's release from the Roman imprisonment and was left there to consolidate the work. if we look at Titus 1, verse 5 and following. The letter urges the use of authority in establishing a worthy ministry and overcoming opposition and in the teaching of sound doctrine. He was summoned to rejoin Paul at Nicopolis when relieved by either Artemas or Tychicus, according to Titus 3:12, and may possibly have been further commissioned at Nicopolis for an evangelistic mission to Dalmatia, on which he was engaged at the time when Paul wrote 2 Timothy. According to 2 Timothy 4:10. Later tradition, however, assumed his return to Crete and described him as a bishop there until his old age. And Eusebius is the one who mentions that. For the possibility that he was Luke's brother, which might explain the absence of his name from Acts, you can consult W.M. Ramsay, who writes about that. Okay. Let's talk about the date. If the writing of Titus takes place within the narrative of Acts, an early date before AD 63 must be adopted for the writing of this letter. If the book was written after the events of Acts, the most popular suggestion is that Paul was initially released from prison, wrote 1 Timothy and Titus, and then was imprisoned once more, writing 2 Timothy from prison in Rome shortly before his death in AD 67 or 68. This would place the writing of Titus sometime around AD 65 or 66. Situation. It is obvious from this letter that Titus is in a leadership position on the island of Crete, where Paul left him. He was tasked with putting things in order and appointing elders in the congregations in every town, according to 1 verse 5. Paul is aware of the challenges Titus faces in carrying out his instructions, as the people of Crete who have come to the faith do so from a very base and godless cultural background. Paul even cites a Cretan author to make the point. And the quote here from chapter 1, verse 12 is, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons." These new believers need competent leadership, and they have much to unlearn from their previous life and much new to absorb of what it means to live in Christ. On the opposite end of the spectrum, however, Paul seems to be concerned about some teachers of a Jewish background who are complicating matters for the Cretan new believers. Their response to the Cretan moral problem is a complex legalism wrapped in conjectural theology. Paul describes these as the circumcision party, chapter 1, verse 10, which seems to indicate an emphasis on strict adherence to the law of Moses. He also says that they focus on Jewish myths, chapter 1, verse 14, and genealogies and quarrels about the law, chapter 3, verse 9. So not only does Titus face a challenging task seeking to bring order to new believers who come from a background very distant from the pattern of life Jesus calls us to, he also faces the added challenge of false teachers who seek to address this godless lifestyle not through reliance on Jesus Christ, but through adherence to the law of Moses and some mystical recasting of Jewish history. So what is Paul's purpose in writing this letter? Paul writes to encourage Titus and to give him practical advice. He wants Titus to succeed in appointing adequate leaders in the lives of the congregations on Crete, people who will help the new believers turn from a godless lifestyle to a new pattern of living in Jesus Christ. He also wants to identify for Titus the marks of false teaching present in the island from troublemakers with a Jewish background who are seeking to draw people's attention away from Jesus and to other matters, such as the law of Moses and fanciful speculations regarding Jewish history. Their approach is divisive and argumentative. Paul hopes with this letter to give Titus the guidance he will need to help believers in Crete navigate these challenges successfully. Also, Paul wants to ask Titus to come and join him in Nicopolis, though he does not indicate why he wants him to do this. And finally, let's turn to 2 Timothy. Let's talk about the provenance. Paul writes in the consciousness that his life is nearly over, chapter 4, verse 6. His word for defense, apologia, is often used of a defense in a law court. It seems then that Paul is in prison, faced with the prospect of speedy execution. He says that Onesiphorus searched for him and found him in Rome, chapter 1, 16 and 17, the place of his current imprisonment. Paul asks Timothy to come to him and pick up Mark on the way, chapter 4, verse 11. So we know that this imprisonment in Rome is not related to the one in Acts. Timothy was with him when he wrote Colossians, as was Mark, according to Colossians 1:1 and 4:10 and Philemon 24, 2 letters generally held to have been written from Rome. Paul appears to have been in Asia Minor not long before he wrote, for he speaks of having left a cloak at Troas, chapter 4, verse 13, of Erastus having stayed behind in Corinth, and of his having left Trophimus sick in Miletus, chapter 4, verse 20. We learn from Acts that Paul had been in prison in Caesarea for 2 years, Acts 20:27, prior to being sent to Rome, and that his journey there was via Crete and Malta. He had thus not been in Asia Minor for quite some time. It is unlikely that he is writing from his imprisonment in Caesarea, which would fit the references to Asia Minor, for Trophimus was with him in Jerusalem when he was arrested, Acts 21:29, and probably Timothy also, Acts 20, verse 4. It seems much more likely that Paul was released from imprisonment, the imprisonment mentioned in Acts, and engaged in missionary activities for a period before being imprisoned again. The probabilities are that 2 Timothy was written during a second imprisonment in Rome, immediately prior to his execution by Nero. For comments about the recipient, just see the comments under 1 Timothy. It's the same recipient. Let's talk about the date. The letter was written probably from Rome during an imprisonment later than the one described in Acts. In that case, the letter was written in the second half of the 60s. If we follow Eusebius in dating the martyrdom of Paul to AD 67, then that or the preceding year will be the date of 2 Timothy, AD 66 or 67. Those who deny Pauline authorship of the letter class it with the other pastorals and usually date it sometime towards the end of the 1st or early 2nd century. The three are normally discussed together, so the arguments are the same as those for 1 Timothy. You can see them previously. What was the situation that gave rise to this letter? We know 2 things with certainty about the situation in which Paul wrote 2 Timothy. He is in prison, chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, and he expects to be executed soon, chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. Paul is accompanied only by Luke as he writes the letter, chapter 4, verse 11. Paul has recently sent Tychicus to Ephesus, chapter 4, verse 12. This was a believer from Asia Minor who had accompanied him to deliver the offering in Jerusalem years back, and who had also met him in prison in Rome when he wrote the letters to the Ephesians and the Colossians, and likely he was the one who delivered the letters, this Tychicus. So what was Paul's purpose in writing this letter? 2 Timothy is Paul's swan song. He knows he is about to die, and this gives his words a poignancy unmatched in his other letters. Paul is not afraid to admit to Timothy that his current incarceration and imminent execution are due to his preaching of the gospel, chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. And yet, his advice to Timothy is still to preach the word in season and out of season. Whether it seems convenient or not, Paul instructs Timothy to preach the very gospel that has landed him on death row. The urgency of Christ's mission is worth any price, any suffering, even death. Paul assures Timothy that the Lord Jesus Christ will reward those who have embraced the gospel, so that even death is a small price to pay for our participation in his kingdom. Paul gives Timothy parting advice for his continued ministry among churches, warning against false teachers and calling him to bold perseverance in the gospel task. He warns him against youthful passions and encourages him to present himself before God as a worthy worker. His desire is that Timothy will participate fully in the work of Christ and do so in a worthy manner, whatever the cost may be.